Live from the second floor of the Victor Senior High School, it's Live from 205, starring Mr. Musk. Today, Musk welcomes Sale Khan, Jim and Otto from the Western Front, the Young Turks, featuring Questlove and those darn Americans. And now, here's Mr. Musk.
Thanks so much and welcome to Live at 205, your most favorite remote lesson of the week. It's so good to be back here in the saddle after several weeks off. Did you miss me, Questlove? Well, that's real nice. That's real nice. Thanks. Well, while I was away, you may remember that Mr. Paul Ojeda was here. Yeah, that guy's a pro. He brought game. And he brought with him the main causes of World War I. Those are printed in the document that you, the viewers at home, have, and the studio audience. Yeah. You've got your militarism. You've got your alliances. Yeah. You've got your imperialism. And you've got your nationalism. What would really help me, though, is if we could lay this all out on a map. So we're going to begin with the segment I like to call, I don't know where that is. Here's what you do. You'll find a Google slide in your assignment. Using colored text and the line tool, you're going to label that map so you no longer have to say, I don't know where that is. It's that simple. Then, move the powder keg icon over the top of the Balkan Mountains, because stuff's gonna explode. When you're done, export that slide and drop it into your packet. When we come back, we'll talk to Sal Khan about the differences between the Western Front and the Eastern Front. You stick around. And we're back with Sal Khan, Jim and Otto from the Western Front, and of course the Young Turks. Quest, you get that map done? All right, good work. Let's turn it over to Sal Khan from the Khan Academy with more about the Western and Eastern Fronts in World War I. Consider pausing the video periodically if you need to record your thoughts. All right, let's roll that clip.
The Eastern and Western fronts, even though they were fronts of the same war, were very different in character. And a lot of it came out of the fact of who was fighting it and especially how big the actual fronts were. So the Western Front, which was generally this region right over here, was a much smaller front than the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was essentially this entire region right over there. And because of that, trench warfare did not become as major of a factor on the Eastern Front. In fact, it was fairly useless on the Eastern Front. If you imagine trying to dig a bunch of trenches, trenches are a huge advantage for the defending army as long as you can block off the entire region with trenches. So over here, you can't go around the trenches. You essentially, if you want to make some ground, an attacking army has to cross the trenches, and because you have now machine guns and the defending soldiers could essentially sit behind their trenches, they could essentially mow down the attacking army very easily. And that's what caused the Western Front, especially after the Schlieffen Plan was not able to be executed on as quickly as possible, it turned into just a stalemate. So you just had a stalemate, a hugely defensive stalemate, because both parties had their trenches. It was hugely advantageous for the defending side. On the Eastern Front, you had this huge front. It was very hard they didn't have enough people to dig trenches across this entire front. And so you can imagine if you tried to dig a trench, but you weren't able to cover the entire front, then the attacking army doesn't have to storm your trench. They don't have to do that anymore. They could just go around your trench. And because trench warfare was not as significant of a factor or wasn't as anywhere near as much of a factor on the Eastern Front, it was a much more fluid front. You had offensives and counteroffensives between the Germans, Austrians on one side, and the Russians on the other. Now, the other factor, and this was mainly with Russia as a variable, the other factor was just what was going on in Russia. So Russia had several things going for it. The main thing is it had a huge army. It had a huge standing army even before the war, and it was able to amass even more. So it had a huge army. But what was going against it, and this is why it eventually had to get into a very unfavorable treaty with the Central Powers near the end of the war, is it had huge internal problems. And I'm not just talking about the military. I'm talking about the entire empire. And it arguably was due to the war, due to the economic and the human costs of the war. But as we enter into 1917, you first have the February Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II has to abdicate the throne because of the riots that are going on, because of the unhappiness, the unease with people literally going hungry, people obviously the morale of the troops going down. And then on top of that, the Russian military, even though it had a huge army in the beginning of the war, the Russian industry wasn't ready to fully supply that army in as good of a way as, say, the German army was. And on top of that, it had communication problems, and it even in the beginning phases of the Eastern Front, it even had issues in terms of coordinating its actual armies. And so what we'll see, and we'll cover this in much more depth in a future video, but what we'll see is Western Front, Schlieffen Plan, not executed as fast as possible, ends up in a stalemate. This did allow the Germans to bring some of their troops back to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians. This goes back and forth, as we'll see, but once you enter into 1917, you have a revolution in Russia. First, you have the February Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II has to abdicate. And then in later that year, you have the Bolsheviks overthrow the interim government, and you now have communist Russia. The Bolsheviks were in no mood to continue to fight the Germans. The military was in no mood to continue to fight the Germans in the Austria-Hungary, and so they essentially get into a treaty with them and kind of take themselves out of the war. So we'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a future video.
Thanks, Khan. We'll be back after these commercial messages.
Jenkins, Oakley. No.
Ein Briter kommt! Ein Briter kommt!
Jim?
Jim, don't do it!
Halt! Er ist nicht bewaffnet! Nein, Otto!
Jim!
My name is Jim.
Mein Name ist Otto.
Pleased to meet you, Otto.
Freut mich.
Rose, she's called.
Das ist schön. Das ist schön.
Frohe Weihnachten.
That ad was produced by Sainsbury, a British biscuit company, in 2014. They're commemorating the 100th anniversary of something called the Christmas Truce. This was the first Christmas celebrated on the Western Front in 1914. You know, when a British biscuit company can make that, I think they should probably change their slogan. You know, we bring a tear to your eye. That's how you know it's good. Below are soldiers' first-hand accounts of what actually happened on December 24th and 25th of 1914. Read through their statements, and then I want you to imagine that you are their commanding officer. How would you handle that situation? Welcome back to Live from 205. Questlove, you're a World War I scholar, right? Have you heard of the Forgotten Genocide? This is a horrible act of systematic violence against the people of Armenia, a region between Turkey and Russia. Over 1.5 million Armenians were killed by the Ottoman Empire during World War I. The weird part is that there's no agreement as to whether or not this is a genocide. Yeah, I know, crazy. Crazy. The research team here at Live from 205 has put together a clip set to get us up to speed. Go ahead, roll that clip.
It's been called the Forgotten Genocide and the Armenian Holocaust by some. Others say it was just the inhumane consequences of war. But no matter what you call it, one thing we know is true. 2 million Armenians were living in the Ottoman Empire at the start of World War I, and by 1922, up to 1.5 million had been killed. But even that number is disputed. So why all the controversy? Well, for starters, modern-day Turkey doesn't like the word genocide. It claims there was no official policy of extermination against the Armenian people and that hundreds of thousands of people died in the region during World War I. President Barack Obama has referred to it as a horror. But American presidents, who want to keep Turkey as a strategic ally in the region, have historically not used the term genocide. Same with the UN. So what exactly happened? Well, 100 years ago, the Ottoman Empire, the ancestral homeland of Armenians, was crumbling. The government of the Young Turks began to paint the minority Christian Armenians as a threat to the state, as some Armenians had sided with Russia at the start of World War I. Armenians marked the beginning of the massacre, or Medzyeghern, as April 24, 1915, when hundreds of Armenian intellectuals were arrested and later executed. From that moment on, there were mass killings of hundreds of thousands of Armenians in the region. The Turkish authorities ordered the forced deportations of the Armenian people mostly to the Syrian desert. During these death marches, the Armenians faced rape, robbery, food deprivation, and murder by Arab or Kurdish tribes along the way. Those who survived the marches ended up in concentration camps.
Փոքրությունը ես շատ լավ եմ հիշում կարծե մեծությունը։ Այդ ալի բաբաս կեբուշակյուղ Թուրքերը սկզբից մեր ծերը հավաքել են հոստով ուր ճանապարհ ընկեք խշտիկը հրազանի ձեր պլետը ցերկը որ խփում է շրա վիզը պատատում ու քաշում է այդ հիշում եմ փոքր կանացի միսուտկա կանացի հասանք Արաբստան Երես բռնազացեր իրտես, հետում ենք, այդ տաժաններն էլ, նստած են ծերին իրանց ինչ կա, այդը, խպելով, պեդով, մեդով, ով շարքի ծուցակալի պեդը խպում, բախումա պախնի պլան, աքսորը շարունակում է, Արաբստանից դերզոր, դերզորից արպա, կետ, որ դարենց ժողորդին, թապեն ընդեղ, գողոդի ժողորդը, էդեղ, որ էտում են հայգա, բանգա, սա խավակում են, շալոն սարկում են, ձերը չի երևում։
The American ambassador at the time wrote in his memoir, when the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race.
Կորկաղդը բերվենք, 8 տարեկան համարը ըննի մեջ է մեղե։ Են էլ թուրքերի հորս սպանին, մնացինք, ես մերս երկու աղբեր։ Սպանում էին, պրնում էին, Kuzargum էին, ամոց բռնապարում էին, ամեն ինչն է տեսել եմ, ամեն սովամա ենք, էտ մենք հատ ենք, ուզում հատ է չէին տալում, ինչ ենք, բոբիկ, տգլիկ, սովար, տարաման ենք,
By the end of the war, a huge portion of the Armenian population had been killed. Many of the survivors fled to the Russian Empire, and in 1918, an independent Armenian Republic was established. Today, it is the Republic of Armenia, an independent country. But because of the massacre, the Armenian diaspora extends throughout the world.
Recently, Pope Francis referred to the mass killings of Armenians by the Ottoman Empire during World War I as the first genocide of the 20th century. In response, Turkey recalled their Vatican City ambassador and declared the Pope's comments to be null and void. Both deniers and believers of the Armenian Genocide claim to have history on their side. So was the Armenian Genocide a genocide? As the Ottoman Empire declined in power during the turn of the 20th century, Turkish leaders suspected the Armenian population of supporting Russia in the Russo-Turkish Wars and during World War I. Starting in the early 20th century, the New York Times began regularly reporting on a series of mass executions of Armenians by the Turks. Most Armenian genocide historians agree that the largest loss of life occurred around 1915, with 1.5 million Armenians left dead from torturous practices like hard labor camps and death marches. France, Canada, and Switzerland are among more than 20 countries which officially acknowledge that the violence against Armenians was a genocide. However, the Turkish government refuses to acknowledge that claim. So, was it a genocide? The United Nations describes genocide in a 1948 convention as the carrying out of acts intended to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. But Turkey denies that they were attempting to destroy the Armenian people. They say that during World War I, both sides experienced casualties. Turkey claims that only about 300,000 to 600,000 Armenians were killed, while Muslims in the region experienced even more casualties, approximately 2.5 million in eastern Anatolia alone. Therefore, Turkey has maintained that the violence towards Armenians did not constitute a genocide. Azerbaijan is one of the only nations to side with Turkey on this issue. So was it a genocide? Most major nations say yes, but the dispute is ongoing, and since Turkey is a powerful ally in the Euro-Asian region, some countries, like the US and the UK, have avoided using the term genocide. Diplomatic alliances in the area are currently in a delicate balance, but dialogue between Armenia and Turkey remains open for now.
We'll be right back. Hey kids, you like the rock and roll? Their debut album, Up Yours King George, sold over 3 million copies. They're on pace to break records with their latest box set, Beyond the Medal of Honor. With their chart-topping hit, Middle Reliever, It's Those Darn Americans.
What do an American president, a telegram to Mexico, Pancho Villa's American arch-nemesis, and a British ocean liner have in common? Find out today on History and Conflict. From 1914 to 1916, President Woodrow Wilson oversaw a country divided. American feelings about the Great War varied widely. The vast majority of the public generally fell into one of four categories. The non-interventionists, who felt strongly that the United States should mind its own business in regards to what they considered strictly a European affair, led by such famed names as William Jennings Bryan, William Randolph Hearst, and Henry Ford. The socialists, who were led by Eugene Debs, who were staunch anti-militarists and saw no need for the United States to get swept up in the military fervor that was sweeping the globe. The liberal internationalists, who reluctantly saw the need for intervention and had some hope of spreading liberal democratic values throughout the imperial world. And finally, the Atlanticists, who were often Anglophiles, supported the Entente, and believed that the U.S. should not only be prepared to enter the war, but emphatically supported U.S. intervention in Europe. So the United States, guided by Woodrow Wilson, stayed neutral. This created both problems and benefits for Americans in regards to their relationship with European countries. The benefits were that the United States had been in a recession, and they were able to sell goods to any country involved in the war. Given that so many countries in Europe were at war and struggling to keep up with grains, goods, and production, the U.S. was in the midst of a booming business, and it was pulling the United States out of the recession and re-energizing the American economy. The majority of Americans wanted to stay neutral, and by staying neutral, this kept the American populace happy. Additionally, the United States was woefully underprepared to go to war in Europe. In fact, in 1915 and 1916, Americans were much more concerned about a war with Mexico and in managing border incursions along their southern border than with anything going on in Europe at the time. Problems cropped up as well. Naturally, when you stay neutral in a war known as the Great War, you're bound to make everyone a little uncomfortable. Staying neutral was also difficult. While the U.S. was able to sell to any country in the war, they were more and more selling to Entente countries, making the German Empire raise an eyebrow and also making Americans worry about whether or not the country holding the largest IOU was going to make it out of this war on top. Seeing that the U.S. was continuing to help the Brits and her allies, the Germans began subtly, or not so subtly depending on how you look at it, undermining American interests. German spying and sabotage in the United States, including the Black Tom explosion in New Jersey and very early attempts to inflame tensions between Mexico and the United States, start turning their prior friendship sour. These tensions explode in May 1915, when the Germans sink a British ocean liner known as the Lusitania. The Lusitania was so explosive because it was seen as an example of unrestricted submarine warfare. Previously during conflict, ships would follow cruiser rules. This meant that they typically did not sink ships carrying civilians, and if they were going to, they gave the civilians the opportunity to disembark the ship. But with U-boats, which could neither take on civilian passengers, and whose biggest advantage was going undetected in the first place, this was not possible. Likewise, the Germans claimed that they had warned the U.S. that they were going to be sinking British merchant ships in a number of American newspapers prior to the sailing of the Lusitania. Americans therefore assumed the risk when choosing to voyage across the Atlantic on a British ocean liner. They also argued that British merchant ships were carrying munitions, and that this meant that the ships were no longer neutral passenger ships, but in fact part of the war machine. The United States in turn argued that Americans should never have been killed in a war that did not involve the United States, and that the U.S. and all neutral countries had a right to freedom of the seas. Wilson was incensed and was faced with making a decision about the relationship with Germany going forward. After all, the Germans killed over 128 innocent Americans. On the other hand, Germany had technically warned them. In the end, Wilson decides to pen a strongly worded diplomatic correspondence to Germany, hoping that previous ties of friendship will allow him to continue to maintain neutrality. Ultimately, the Germans, censured by this disapproval, agree to halt unrestricted warfare, allowing Wilson and the United States to remain neutral. However, the U.S. had taken the sinking of the Lusitania and other encroachments of the Germans on their neutrality to heart. They'd reflected on the size of their military and their readiness and came to the conclusion that some measure of preparedness was going to be necessary. So the National Defense Act of 1916 was passed. This act, part of the preparedness movement, and therefore controversial in its own way, led to the expansion of the Army and the National Guard. It also allowed for the federalization of the National Guard. It created an aviation branch of the Army, and it set aside money for research and materials needed for defense. By keeping the peace between the United States and Europe, Wilson was able to run on a re-election platform of neutrality. In fact, many of those who voted for him because he kept them out of the war. In January 2017, Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated for a second term. And then, it all went to hell in a handbasket. Germany announced it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare the next month. The US and other countries were furious. And at the same time, a German official, Arthur Zimmermann, was penning an encrypted telegram to Mexico. The telegram read, "We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance." It was sent on the 19th of January. The British intercepted and decoded the telegram, but hesitated on whether or not to share it with the US. The fact that the British are able to decode German messages is an important and closely guarded secret. Ultimately, however, the British decide that the Americans deserve to know, and in late February, a decoded copy is delivered to the U.S. ambassador and, once verified, President Wilson. On February 28, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson releases the text of the telegram to the media. The initial public reaction to the telegram is mixed. Some people are furious, but others believe it's a British plot to get the United States to go to war on their side. The next month, however, Arthur Zimmermann confirms the authenticity of the telegram. The sinking of the ships with Americans aboard and the sabotage by German spies and the Zimmermann telegram had created growing and significant tensions between the US and Germany. While some still supported pacifism and isolationism, public opinion had turned against Germany. Economically, it was becoming more and more obvious that America desperately needed to support the Allies, who were accumulating huge debts to the United States. If they defaulted, the United States would almost certainly plunge back into recession and perhaps even a depression. The return to unrestricted submarine warfare was the final nail in the friendship coffin for the United States and Germany. On April 2nd, President Wilson requests that Congress recognize that the United States was already at war with Germany and to officially announce it with a declaration. On April 4th, the Senate approved the request. On April 6th, Congress formally announced a declaration of war on the German Empire.
What a fantastic show we had today. Have a great day, everyone. And as Wapel says, be good people, make good decisions, and make the world a better place.